July 1916. The United States was on the precipice of change. In Europe, the Great War was raging, consuming a generation of young men in the trenches of France. But here, on the shores of New Jersey, the war felt a world away. It was the height of the Gilded Age, a time of innocence, prosperity, and leisure. But that summer, a different kind of enemy was approaching the American coast. It arrived under the cover of a historic heat wave that baked the asphalt of New York City and Philadelphia, driving sweltering crowds to the cooling relief of the Atlantic Ocean. The heat was relentless. Temperatures soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. To make matters worse, a terrifying polio epidemic was sweeping through the cities, paralyzing children. Terrified parents fled the cramped urban centers, packing trains to the seaside resorts of the Jersey Shore. They believed the fresh salt air and the ocean water would protect their families. They believed the beach was a sanctuary. They were wrong. To understand the horror of what happened during those 12 days in July, you must understand the mindset of the era. In 1916, the ocean was considered safe. Marine biologists and scientists of the time firmly believed that sharks were harmless scavengers. The leading experts argued that a shark's jaw was not strong enough to snap a human bone. A wealthy banker named Herman Ulrichs even offered a $500 reward, a fortune at the time, to anyone who could prove a shark had ever attacked a human north of Cape Hatteras. The reward went unclaimed for 25 years. The screams of the naked, terrified boys running down Main Street shattered the drowsy afternoon silence of Matawan. They burst into the town center, their faces pale, shouting that a monster had taken Lester Stilwell. At first, the adults were skeptical. A shark in the creek, it sounded like a prank gone wrong. Or perhaps the boys had seen a snapping turtle and panicked. But the sheer hysteria in their voices, the way they shook uncontrollably, convinced the Sones people that something terrible had indeed happened at the Wyckoff dock. Among those who heard the screams was Stanley Fisher. Fisher was 24 years old, a well-liked local tailor. He was a giant of a man, over 6 feet tall, weighing 230 pounds, with broad shoulders and a reputation for immense physical strength. He had just opened a dry cleaning business and was a central figure in the community. When he heard the news, he didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He closed his shop and ran towards the creek. Fisher wasn't alone. A crowd of men, armed with whatever they could grab, pitchforks, ropes, old shotguns, followed him to the water's edge. When they arrived at the dock, the scene was eerily quiet. The water was still. The only evidence of the attack was the lingering, dissipating cloud of blood in the center of the channel, and Lester's clothes piled neatly on the wooden planks. The denial was still strong in some. It must have been a cramp, one man argued. The boy drowned and these kids just panicked. Stanley Fisher refused to accept that. He looked at the blood. He looked at the terror in the boy's eyes. He knew Lester was down there, and if there was a chance, however slim, that the boy was still alive, pinned underwater, Fisher was going to find him. Fisher began to organize the rescue. He was a natural leader. He directed men to launch boats and form a line across the creek to probe the bottom with poles. But the creek was deep here. A depression in the riverbed known as the swimming hole dropped to nearly 12 feet at high tide. The poles weren't touching anything. "I'm going in," Fisher announced. "Don't do it, Stan," a friend warned him. "If there is something in there." "I'm going in," Fisher repeated. He stripped off his coat and boots. He didn't dive recklessly. He waded into the murky water, his face set in a grim expression of determination. He knew the risks. He knew Captain Cottrell had warned them. But Stanley Fisher was a man of action. He believed his size and strength would protect him. He believed that even if there was a shark, he could fight it off, or scare it away. It was a brave thought, but a fatal miscalculation. No human, no matter how strong, is a match for a great white in its own element. Fisher began to dive. He would disappear under the brown surface, holding his breath, feeling along the muddy bottom with his hands. He did this repeatedly, surfacing for air, shaking his head. Nothing, he gasped. Can't see a thing. It's pitch black down there. The crowd on the bank watched in silence. The tension was unbearable. Every time Fisher went under, the clock ticked. 1 minute, 2 minutes. He would burst up, gasping, wiping mud from his eyes. He was diving into a zero-visibility tomb, searching for a body, unaware that the killer was likely watching him from the shadows. The shark hadn't left. This is the most terrifying aspect of the Matawan attacks. Most predators strike and flee. This animal was territorial. It had claimed the creek. It was lurking in the deep channel, perhaps confused by the taste of the first victim, or perhaps guarding its kill. It sensed the disturbance in the water. It felt the pressure waves of the large man diving and splashing. On his final dive, Fisher found something. His hands brushed against a small limp form on the riverbed. He had found Lester Stillwell. The boy was pinned under a submerged log or tangled in roots. Fisher grabbed the boy's body. He planted his feet in the mud and pulled, preparing to kick off the bottom and surface with the child. At that exact moment, the shark struck. The attack was not a nip. It was a collision. The shark slammed into Fisher's right hip with the force of a freight truck. The impact was visible from the surface. The water humped up violently, and Fisher was jerked sideways. Under the water, the nightmare unfolded. Fisher, immense and powerful, didn't give up. He fought back. He punched at the rough skin of the beast, but the shark had clamped down on his thigh, its serrated teeth soaring through muscle and artery. Fisher managed to drag himself and the shark towards the surface, breaking the water for a split second. The crowd saw him emerge. He wasn't holding the boy. He was fighting for his life. He looked at the people on the bank, his eyes wide with shock. He didn't scream. He simply gasped, "He's got me." Then he was pulled under again. A chaotic tug of war ensued. Fisher was fighting to reach the bank. The shark was trying to drag him into the deep channel. Men on the dock lunged forward, grabbing Fisher's arms. They pulled. For a horrifying second, the shark held on, thrashing its tail, trying to claim the second victim. The water turned a deep, opaque red. Finally, sensing the resistance, the shark released its grip. It vanished into the gloom. The men dragged Stanley Fisher onto the muddy bank. He was conscious, but the injury was catastrophic. A massive portion of his right thigh was gone. The femoral artery was severed, pumping lifeblood onto the grass. The crowd recoiled in horror. This was the proof. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a myth. A monster was eating their neighbors. They applied a tourniquet. A rope tightened with a stick, but the bleeding was impossible to stop. Fisher looked up at his friends, his face draining of color. He was calm, almost peaceful. "I found him," he whispered. "I found Lester. He's down there." They rushed Fisher to the railway station to put him on a train to the hospital in Long Branch. He would fight for his life for hours, displaying an inhuman resilience. But the loss of blood was too great. Stanley Fisher, the hero of Matawan, would die on the operating table that evening. But the horror wasn't over. The shark was still in the creek, and incredibly, half an hour after mauling Fisher, a half-mile downstream, it would attack again. A young boy named Joseph Dunn was swimming near a brickyard, unaware of the tragedy upstream. The shark grabbed his leg. A frantic tug of war occurred between the shark and Joseph's brother, who pulled him from the jaws. Joseph survived,
but his leg was flayed to the bone. 3 attacks. 1 creek. In less than an hour, the town of Matawan had been transformed from a peaceful hamlet into a war zone. The water was no longer water. It was death. As night fell on July 12th, the townspeople didn't sleep. They gathered dynamite. They sharpened harpoons. They loaded guns. They were going to kill the creek. The sun set on Matawan on July 12, 1916. But darkness did not bring sleep. It brought fury. The town was in a state of collective shock that rapidly curdled into a violent thirst for vengeance. In the span of a single afternoon, a predator from the deep ocean had violated the sanctity of their home, killing a beloved local boy and mortally wounding the town hero Stanley Fisher. The creek, once a source of leisure and industry, was now viewed as a malignant entity that needed to be purged. By 8:00 p.m., news of Fisher's death at the Monmouth Memorial Hospital reached the town square. The grief was instant, but so was the mobilization. The mayor of Matawan, Aris Keeler, didn't wait for state assistance. He authorized a response that was less like a pest control operation and more like a military bombardment. He placed a bounty on the shark's head, $100 for the beast, dead or alive. Hundreds of men descended on the banks of Matawan Creek. They came from the brickyards, the farms, and the shops, carrying lanterns, pitchforks, rifles, and handguns. But they brought heavier artillery too. The local industrial workers raided their supplies for dynamite. What followed was a scene of apocalyptic chaos. Under the flickering light of torches and bonfires, the men lined the muddy banks. They threw sticks of dynamite into the brown water, counting down the seconds, until the dull whump of the underwater explosions sent geysers of mud and water shooting into the air. They believed the concussion would kill the shark, or at least stun it, forcing it to float to the surface. Explosion after explosion rocked the creek bed. Dead fish, turtles, and eels floated to the top, victims of the shock waves. But the gray monster did not appear. The men grew frustrated. They fired rifles blindly into the water at every shadow, every ripple. The serene countryside sounded like the Western Front of the Great War. While the dynamiting continued, a more strategic effort was underway downstream. A group of local fishermen realized that the shark, if it was still in the creek, would try to escape back to the ocean when the tide turned. They stretched a heavy chicken wire net across the narrowest part of the creek, near the train trestle. They reinforced it with heavy ropes and guarded it with men armed with shotguns. They were sealing the exit. Sometime just before dawn, the men guarding the net felt a massive impact. The heavy ropes groaned. The water surged violently against the wire mesh. "It's here," someone shouted. "It's hitting the net." The men rushed to the edge, aiming their lights and guns. Something immense and powerful was thrashing against the barrier, trying to push through back to the Raritan Bay. The shark was fighting to escape the killbox. It battered the wire fence with its snout, thrashing its tail, churning the water into a frothing foam. The men fired. Shotgun blasts peppered the water, but aiming at a moving target in the dark, through murky water, is nearly impossible. The shark, sensing the trap, turned back upstream, disappearing into the gloom. The mood in Matawan shifted from rage to paranoia. They had it trapped, or so they thought. The realization that a 9-foot man-eater was currently locked in the creek with them, alive, angry, and potentially wounded, was terrifying. As the sun rose on July 13th, the war on the creek intensified. The story had hit a national newswire. Reporters from the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and cameramen from newsreel companies swarmed the small town. Matawan became the center of the universe. The creek banks were lined not just with vigilantes, but with spectators. They brought in a diving suit. A brave, or perhaps foolish, diver volunteered to go down into the dynamite-blasted waters to search for the body of Lester Stillwell, which had still not been recovered. The crowd watched in hushed silence as the helmeted figure descended into the same muddy depths, where Stanley Fisher had been mauled less than 24 hours earlier. The diver found Lester's body later that day. It was located 150 yards upstream from the Wyckoff dock. The shark had dragged the boy but hadn't eaten him. This detail chilled the biologists. The shark had killed for the sake of killing. Or perhaps it had been interrupted. But despite the dynamite, the nets, the guns, and the divers, the shark itself remained elusive. It had vanished. The men guarding the net swore it hadn't passed them. The men upstream swore it hadn't passed them. It was as if the creek had swallowed the monster. Rumors began to spread. Had it buried itself in the mud? Had it died from the dynamite wounds and sunk to the bottom? Or most terrifying of all, had it found a way out? The answer came later that afternoon, when the men checked the net at the mouth of the creek. There near the bottom, they found a tear, a hole in the wire mesh, bent outward by brute force. The realization hit them like a cold wave. The shark hadn't died. It hadn't hidden. It had smashed through their defenses in the chaos of the night. The killer of Matawan was gone. It had slipped past the guards, past the guns, and returned to the open waters of the Raritan Bay. It was free, and it was heading back to the ocean, leaving a traumatized town and 2 dead bodies in its wake. The war on the creek was over. The hunt for the devil of the sea was just beginning. The realization that the killer had escaped Matawan Creek did not bring relief. It brought a terrified paralysis to the entire eastern seaboard. The shark was no longer contained in a narrow, muddy ditch, where men with pitchforks could hunt it. It was back in the Raritan Bay, a vast body of water that feeds directly into the Atlantic Ocean and the busy harbors of New York City. The monster was loose, invisible, and following a trail of blood that had now claimed 4 lives in 12 days. The panic that followed is difficult for us to comprehend today. In 1916, the ocean was the primary escape from the crushing summer heat. Air conditioning did not exist. For the millions of workers in New York, Philadelphia, and New Jersey, the beach was the only respite. But suddenly, the ocean was forbidden. The headlines of the New York Times screamed in bold type, "Shark kills 2 bathers." The beaches, usually packed with tens of thousands of people, were deserted. The boardwalks were silent ghost towns. This was the first shark panic in American history. It changed the way humanity looked at the sea forever. Before July 1916, the ocean was viewed as a playground. After July 1916, it was viewed as a wilderness filled with monsters. Sightings of sharks, real and imagined, were reported everywhere. A floating log became a dorsal fin. A shadow in a wave became a man-eater. Fishermen reported seeing schools of sharks patrolling the coast, leading to a hysteria that bordered on mass delusion. The crisis reached the highest levels of government. The economic impact on the resort towns was catastrophic, losing millions of dollars a day. The mayors of seaside towns demanded action. The pressure became so intense that it reached the White House. President Woodrow Wilson, a man occupied with the looming threat of the Great War in Europe, was forced to convene a cabinet meeting to discuss the shark problem. It was an unprecedented moment, the United States government declaring war on President Wilson directed the Secretary of the Treasury to deploy the Coast Guard. The federal government authorized the use of armed cutters to patrol the Jersey shoreline. It was Operation Jaws. 60 years before the move, ships, equipped with light cannons and machine guns, steamed up and down the coast, instructed to shoot any large fish on sight. It was a war of extermination. Meanwhile, the resorts took desperate measures to save their summer season. They installed massive steel wire nets around the swimming areas, enclosing the bathers in underwater cages. Shark-proof became the new marketing slogan, but for many, the psychological damage was done. The image of Stanley Fisher bleeding to death on a riverbank, and the story of the shark swimming 10 miles inland, had proven that nowhere was safe. If the shark could enter a backyard creek, it could go anywhere. In the Raritan Bay, the hunt turned into a chaotic free-for-all. A bounty had been placed on the shark's head, and every man with a boat and a rifle wanted to claim it. The bay was filled with a flotilla of small motorboats, skiffs, and trawlers. They chummed the water with dead fish and sheep carcasses, turning the bay into a slick of blood and oil, hoping to lure the devil out of the deep. Among this chaotic navy of shark hunters was a taxidermist from New York named Michael Schleiser. Unlike the angry vigilantes with dynamite, Schleiser was a man who understood animals. He operated a small motorboat, armed not with military-grade explosives, but with a simple net and a broken oar. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for a specimen. Schleiser knew something the others didn't. He understood that a predator that had fed recently might not be frenzied. It might be lethargic, digesting its meal in the deeper, cooler waters of the bay. While the other boats sped around making noise and firing guns, Schleiser drifted. He moved slowly near the mouth of the bay, watching the currents. The atmosphere on the water was tense. The heat wave had finally broken, but the sky was gray and heavy. The water of the Raritan Bay was choppy. Every fisherman knew that the killer was likely still there. A shark that enters a feeding cycle like this doesn't simply stop. It continues until it is killed, or until the water gets too cold. The Matawan man-eater had tasted human flesh repeatedly. It had learned that humans were slow, soft, and easy to catch. It wasn't fleeing to the deep Atlantic. It was lingering near the coast, waiting for the next opportunity. On the afternoon of July 14th, 2 days after the massacre at the creek, the bay was quiet. Most of the hunters had given up for the day. Schleiser was trawling a heavy-weighted net behind his small boat. Suddenly, the line went tight. The boat shuddered and stopped dead in the water. Schleiser assumed he had snagged a rock or a submerged log. He killed the engine and began to haul in the net by hand. It was heavy, dead weight. He strained against the rope, pulling inch by inch. As the net neared the surface, the water began to boil. It wasn't a rock. The net erupted in a fury of white foam and gray muscle. Schleiser had hooked something massive, and it wasn't happy. He had found the needle in the haystack, but as the creature surfaced, thrashing violently against the side of his small wooden boat, Schleiser realized he had made a terrible mistake. He hadn't trapped the shark. He had merely tethered himself to it. The boat tipped dangerously. The shark, nearly 9 feet long, began to slam its body against the hull, snapping its jaws at the gunwale. This was not a cowardly scavenger. This was a fighter. It was the same aggression that had been seen in the creek, the same fury that had killed fish. Schleiser was alone, miles from shore, attached to a monster that was threatening to sink him. The hunter had become the prey. The battle that erupted on the afternoon of July 14th in the choppy waters of the Raritan Bay was not a hunt. It was a brawl. Michael Schleiser was not a big game fisherman. He was a taxidermist, a man who worked with dead animals, not living monsters. He was sitting in an 8-foot wooden skiff, a vessel barely larger than the predator he had just accidentally ensnared. When the net went tight, the boat didn't just stop. It was jerked backward, the stern dipping dangerously low into the gray swells. The shark had realized it was trapped. The creature that had navigated the Matawan Creek with silent stealth now unleashed a fury of pure kinetic energy. It thrashed against the mesh of the net, its tail beating the water into a white froth. The boat rocked violently, taking on water. Schleiser scrambled to keep his footing on the slick wooden deck, grabbing the gunwale to keep from being thrown overboard. If he fell in now, entangled in the same net as the shark, he would be dead in seconds. The shark surfaced for the first time. Schleiser got a clear look at the Devil of Jersey. It was terrifying. It wasn't the dull, sluggish animal often portrayed in textbooks. It was a muscle-bound torpedo, slate gray on top and white underneath, with a conical snout and black, void-like eyes. It measured nearly 8 feet in length and weighed over 350 pounds. It was a juvenile great white, the perfect age for agility and speed. The shark didn't try to swim away. It attacked the boat. It lunged at the stern, snapping its jaws at the wooden planks and the propeller of the outboard motor. The sound of teeth grating against wood echoed over the water. The boat tipped sharply to the starboard side. Schleiser realized with horror that the shark was trying to capsize him. It was using its weight to pull the gunwale down to the water level. Schleicher had no rifle, he had no harpoon. In a panic, he looked around the bottom of the boat for a weapon. His hand closed around the handle of a heavy wooden bilge pump, essentially a thick oak club. It was a pitiful defense against a creature designed by millions of years of evolution to kill. But it was all he had. As the shark lunged again, its head breaking the surface just inches from Schleicher's face, the taxidermist swung. He brought the heavy wood down with all his strength, aiming for the sensitive nose of the beast. Crack! The blow connected. The shark thrashed, splashing water into the boat, soaking Schleicher. It retreated for a split second, shaking its head, then came back with renewed ferocity. It was a fight for survival in a space smaller than a closet. Schleicher swung again and again. He wasn't fighting for a trophy. He was fighting to keep his boat afloat. He struck the shark across the gills, its most vulnerable point. The water around the boat began to turn pink with blood, not from the man, but from the fish. The shark, entangled in the heavy cords of the net and battered by the desperate blows, began to lose its rhythm. Its movements became jerky. It thrashed wildly, tangling itself tighter and tighter in the mesh, essentially suffocating itself. Finally, after what felt like an hour, but was likely only 10 minutes of intense violence, Schleicher delivered a crushing blow to the shark's head. The beast shuddered. The thrashing it rolled onto its side, its white belly exposed to the gray sky, its mouth gaping open to reveal rows of serrated, triangular teeth. Schleicher collapsed onto the bench of his boat, gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs. Like a trapped bird, the silence returned to the bed. The only sound was the slap of waves against the hull, and the heavy, rasping breathing of the man. He looked down at the prize floating alongside his boat. It looked dead, but Schleicher knew better than to trust a shark. He didn't dare try to haul it into the small skiff. The weight would sink him, and if the animal was merely stunned, it would tear him apart in the confined space. He decided to tow it. He secured the net lines to the stern cleat of his boat, double-checking the knots with trembling hands. He started his small engine. The motor sputtered and whined, protesting against the dead weight of the monster dragging behind. The journey back to the shore was a slow, agonizing crawl. Every few minutes, Schleicher would look back, paranoid that the gray shape would wake up and renew the attack. The shark acted as a sea anchor, slowing the boat to a crawl. The sky was darkening. If night fell while he was still out on the water with the man-eater, and if the shark revived, the thought was too terrifying to entertain. He pushed the throttle forward, willing the old engine to hold together. He headed for the docks at South Amboy. As he approached the pier, a few dock workers paused their labor to watch the small boat struggling against the tide. They saw the strain on the tow line. They saw the massive dark shape trailing in the wake. "Hey, what have you got there?" one of the men shouted. Schleicher cut the engine and drifted towards the pilings. He stood up, wiped the sweat and salt from his eyes, and yelled back, his voice hoarse, "I think I got it. I think I got the Jersey Devil." The news spread through the town of South Amboy like an electric current. By the time Schleicher had tied up his boat, a crowd had begun to gather. Men ran from the fish markets. Women stopped their shopping. Children pushed their way to the front of the pier. Everyone wanted to see the monster. Schleicher, with the help of a crane operator and several strong men, hoisted the shark out of the water. As the winch groaned and the cable tightened, the massive body of the great white rose from the bay, dripping water and blood. It hung there, rotating slowly in the evening light, a suspended nightmare. The crowd gasped. Up close, the shark was even more impressive. Its girth was massive. Its teeth were white and razor-sharp. But immediately, the debate began. Skepticism is a powerful human defense mechanism. "That's just a shark," a local fisherman scoffed, spitting tobacco into the water. "There's plenty of sharks in the ocean. That doesn't mean it's the one that killed those people in the creek. The creek is miles away. It's too small. Another man argued the thing that killed Stanley Fisher must have been 20 feet long to take his leg off. Schleicher stood by his catch, exhausted but defiant. He was a taxidermist. He knew anatomy. He looked at the shark's jaw. It was the right size. He looked at the species. A great white. A known man-eater. Unlike the sand tigers usually found in the bay. But he knew that looking at the outside wouldn't prove anything. The ocean was full of sharks. To claim the bounty, and to end the panic that had paralyzed the nation, he needed proof. Absolute, undeniable proof. And there was only one place to find it. The crowd pressed in closer. As Schleicher asked for a knife, the atmosphere on the dock shifted from curiosity to morbid tension. They weren't just looking at a dead fish anymore. They were looking at a crime scene investigation. If this was the killer, the evidence would be inside. Schleicher took a long, sharp flensing knife. He positioned himself under the hanging belly of the beast. The shark's stomach was distended, bulging with its last meal. The silence on the dock was absolute. Hundreds of people held their breath. The only sound was the wind in the rigging of the nearby boats, and the seagulls crying over. He placed the tip of the knife against the white skin of the shark's underbelly. He pushed. The skin was tough, like sandpaper, but the blade was sharp. He began to cut. A long incision from the pelvic fins up towards the throat. The stomach of the shark spilled out. It was heavy. Schleicher sliced open the stomach lining. The smell hit them first. A horrific stench of digestion and rot. Then the contents spilled onto the wooden dock. There was a collective recoil from the crowd. A woman's scream amidst the mucus and the partially digested fish. There were objects that did not belong in the ocean. There were bones, large bones, and there was flesh. Schleicher used the tip of his knife to separate the mass. He identified a shin bone, a human tibia, then a piece of a and finally, a mass of flesh that was unmistakably human. The debate ended instantly. The skepticism evaporated. The crowd stared in horrified fascination at the biological evidence lying on the wet wood. This wasn't just a shark. This was the shark. The belly of the beast held the remains of Charles Vincent, Charles Bruger, or perhaps Lester Stilwell. The monster of 1916 had been caught. The dragnet had worked. The war on the shark was over. But as the sun set over the bloody scene on the docks of South Amboy, a new kind of fear was settling in. The mystery was solved, but the reality was far worse than the legend. A single fish had traveled from the deep ocean to a backyard creek, consumed 4 people, and changed the American psyche forever. The autopsy continued into the night. Scientists were called in from New York. They weighed the human remains, 15 pounds of flesh and bone. They identified the species definitively: Carcharodon, Carcharias, the great white shark. But even as the proof was catalogued, a question remained, a question that haunts marine biologists to this day. Was it really just one shark, or was this great white simply the one that got caught? The attack stopped after Schleicher's kill, suggesting the culprit was dead, but the Mattafaman Creek attacks had the hallmark of a bull shark, a species known for tolerating fresh water far better than a great white. Could a great white really survive 10 miles up a brackish creek? Or did Schleicher catch the ocean killer, while the creek killer slipped away, unseen, back into the mud? The body of the shark was eventually mounted and displayed in the window of a shop in New York City, drawing thousands of spectators. It became a celebrity, but the bones found in its stomach were quietly buried. The summer of 1916 ended. The heat wave broke. The polio epidemic subsided, but the beaches of New Jersey were never the same. The innocence was gone. The ocean was no longer a playground. It was a wilderness, and every person who stepped into the surf from that day forward did so with a new, lingering thought in the back of their mind: what is swimming out there in the dark? This concludes the narrative of the hunt.
But the science of what happened leaves us with one final terrifying chapter.
This scientific arrogance created a false sense of security. Feathers in heavy wool, swimsuits frolicked in the surf, oblivious to the fact that the biological rules they trusted were about to be rewritten in blood. Just beneath the surface of the turquoise water, a shadow was moving. It was a biological anomaly, a predator that had left the deep ocean to patrol the shallow sandbars where children played. This was not just an animal looking for food. It was a force of nature that would systematically dismantle the feeling of safety in America. It began in the luxury resort of Beach Haven, moved north to the exclusive hotels of Spring Lake, and then did the impossible. It turned its back on the vast Atlantic Ocean and entered a narrow, freshwater tidal inlet. It began to swim inland. Before we follow this monster into the murky waters of the creek, I want to ask you a question about your own instincts. We all know the fear of deep, open water, the feeling that something is swimming beneath our feet in the ocean. But what if you were swimming in a quiet river, 10 miles from the sea, in your own backyard? Would you feel safe? Would you ever imagine a shark could find you there? Tell me in the comments below, where is the one place you feel absolutely safe swimming? Because after this story, that answer might change. The events of 1916 are the direct inspiration for Peter Benchley's novel Jaws and the Steven Spielberg masterpiece that followed. But as terrifying as the movie is, the true story is far worse. In the movie, the shark stays in the ocean. In reality, the beast of 1916 navigated a winding, shallow creek, passing under road bridges and train tracks, effectively hunting people in their own neighborhoods. It defied every known behavior of its species. It adapted to fresh water. It ignored the abundance of fish to target humans, and it displayed a level of persistence that bordered on malevolence. For 12 days, panic gripped the East Coast. Armed vigilantes patrolled the beaches with shotguns. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, convened cabinet meetings to discuss the shark problem. Steel nets were erected to protect swimmers. The innocence of the American summer was over. What drove a massive great white, or perhaps a bull shark, to travel so far out of its element? Was it the heat? Was it hunger? Or was it a singular, rogue maniac? A term scientists hate, but one that seems to fit this specific creature. We are going to track the timeline of the terror, hour by hour, from the first bite in Beach Haven to the bloody climax in a muddy creek where a town fought back with dynamite and harpoons. The water is warm, the sun is shining. The beaches are crowded with thousands of people looking for relief from the heat. But the tide is coming in, and it is bringing something cold and hungry with it. Welcome to the summer of 1916. Welcome to the story of the real Jaws. July 1st, 1916. Beach Haven, New Jersey. The name of the town was a promise. Beach Haven. It was a sanctuary for the elite of Philadelphia, a place where the wealthy could escape the suffocating heat and the noise of the industrial city. The centerpiece of this paradise was the Ingleside Hotel, a sprawling Victorian masterpiece with wraparound porches, white wicker furniture, and a dining room that served 5-course meals on fine china. On this particular Saturday evening, the atmosphere was one of lazy contentment. The sun was beginning to dip low on the horizon, painting the Atlantic Ocean in shades of gold and violet. The air smelled of salt spray, cigar smoke, and the roasting dinners being prepared in the hotel kitchen. Among the guests was Charles Epting Vincent. At 25 years old, Vincent was the picture of the American dream. He was handsome, athletic, and intelligent, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and the son of a prominent Philadelphia doctor. He had his whole life ahead of him. He had arrived in Beach Haven with his family just hours earlier, eager to start his vacation. Before dinner,
Charles decided to take a quick dip in the ocean to wash off the dust of the train ride. He walked down to the shoreline, accompanied by a playful Chesapeake Bay retriever. The beach was thinning out as people headed indoors to dress for the evening, but there were still a few bathers lingering in the surf. Charles waded into the water. The Atlantic was calm that evening, the waves gentle. He swam out about 100 yards, just beyond the breakers, where the water was deep enough to float comfortably, but shallow enough to stand if he dropped his feet. He was a strong swimmer, confident in his ability. He began to play with the dog, shouting and splashing, his laughter carrying over the water back to his family watching from the dunes. It is important to visualize this scene. It is 1916. There is no fear of the water. The concept of a shark attack was as alien to these people as an alien abduction would be to us today. When people looked at the ocean, they saw beauty and health. They did not see a hunting ground, but something else was in the water that evening. It had followed the warm Gulf Stream current north, sensing the vibrations of the bathers. It was a massive shadow darker than the deep green water, cruising silently along the sandbar. It detected the rhythmic splashing of the man and the dog. To a predator, splashing signals distress. It signals prey. The shadow turned. It began to close the distance, moving with a terrifying, singular purpose. On the beach, the lifeguards were packing up for the day. One of them, Alexander Ott, was a former Olympic swimmer. He was scanning the water one last time when he noticed something strange. A dark, triangular fin cut through the surface of the water, trailing a wake behind it. It was moving fast, heading straight for the young man playing with the dog. Ott shouted, but the wind carried his voice away. He blew his whistle, the shrill sound piercing the air. Vincent heard it. He turned towards the shore confused. He saw the people on the beach waving their arms, pointing. He must have thought they were cheering him on, or perhaps warning him about the undertow. He began to swim back leisurely, still laughing. Then the shark struck. It didn't attack the dog. It bypassed the animal and targeted the larger silhouette. The first impact was subtle. A bump, a test. Vincent stopped swimming. He looked down, puzzled. Suddenly he screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of pure, unadulterated shock. "Watch me float," he had shouted moments earlier, joking. Now he was screaming, "Help! He's got me." From the shore it looked like a struggle with a cramp. Vincent was thrashing violently, the water around him churning white. But then the white foam turned, a bright, shocking crimson. Alexander Ott and a bystander named Sheridan Taylor didn't hesitate. They launched a lifeboat and rowed furiously towards the victim. As they got closer, the horror of the situation became clear. This wasn't a cramp. A massive grey body was thrashing alongside Vincent. The shark had clamped its jaws onto the young man's left leg and was refusing to let go. It was shaking him like a rag doll, trying to tear the limb from the socket. Ott lunged for Vincent, grabbing his arms. He pulled, but the shark held on. For a terrifying moment, a tug-of-war ensued between the men in the boat and the monster in the water, with Charles Vincent as the rope. The shark's eyes were rolled back, its teeth sunk deep into the femoral artery. Finally, unwilling to beach itself in the shallow water, the shark released its grip. It slipped back into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. Ott and Taylor dragged Vincent into the boat. The young man was conscious, but he was unnaturally pale. The bottom of the boat began to fill with blood. They rowed back to the shore, their muscles burning, shouting for a doctor. A crowd had gathered. The festive atmosphere of the Ingleside Hotel had evaporated. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns ran down to the sand. Vincent's father, Dr. Eugene Vincent, pushed his way through the crowd. He fell to his knees beside his son. The injury was catastrophic. The flesh of Charles's left thigh had been stripped away to the bone. The femoral artery was severed. Dr. Vincent tried to apply a tourniquet, his hand shaking, his medical training warring with his fatherly grief. But the damage was too severe. The shark hadn't just bitten. It had removed a massive amount of tissue. They carried Charles into the lobby of the Ingleside Hotel. They laid him on the reception desk. the blood staining the polished wood and the Persian rugs. The guests stood in stunned silence, the sound of the ocean outside now sounding like a threat. At 6:45 p.m., less than an hour after he had walked into the surf laughing, Charles Efting Vincent bled to death on the hotel desk. He whispered his father's name, closed his eyes and was gone. The tragedy was absolute. But what happened next was even more disturbing. As the sun set over Beach Haven, the shock turned into denial. The witnesses had seen a fin, the lifeguards had seen a gray monster, but the experts, the scientists, the media, and the hotel owners refused to accept the truth. They looked at the mangled body of the young man and said, "Impossible." This was the beginning of the denial, and because of this denial, the shark was free to swim north. It wasn't done. The dinner bell had just rung. Video script. Chapter 1. The Denial. Part B. Narration text only. The sun rose over Beach Haven on July 2nd, illuminating a town in a state of cognitive dissonance. A man lay dead in the local undertaker's parlor, his body mangled by a predator from the sea. Yet, as the morning papers hit the stands, and the telegrams flew back and forth to New York and Philadelphia, the narrative began to twist. The truth was too horrifying, too damaging to the economy, and too scientifically impossible to be accepted. The hotel owners were panic-stricken. The 4th of July weekend, the most profitable weekend of the year, was 2 days away. If the word got out that a man-eating shark was patrolling the Jersey Shore, the trains would arrive empty. Millions of dollars were at stake. So a new story was crafted. The death of Charles Vincent was classified as a tragic anomaly. The local authorities and the press began to float alternative theories, desperate to exonerate the ocean. They suggested it wasn't a shark at all. It was a sea turtle. One newspaper suggested a giant loggerhead turtle, they argued, could have snapped at the man with its beak. It was a tuna, claimed another expert, or perhaps a swordfish thrashing about. Some even suggested that Vincent had been attacked by a frantic porpoise, or in the most absurd theory of all, a German U-boat torpedo that had gone astray, referencing the war across the Atlantic. Dr. Eugene Vincent, grieving and furious, knew what he had seen. He described the bite marks to anyone who would listen. He spoke of the triangular teeth, the serrated edges, the sheer power of the animal, but his voice was drowned out by the chorus of scientific authority. The leading ichthyologists of the time, based in museums in New York and Washington, were firm in their dogma. Sharks, they insisted, were timid scavengers. They lacked the jaw strength to shear through human bone. They were sea hyenas, cowardly and harmless, unless provoked. The idea of a shark attacking a live swimming human in shallow water was dismissed as a fisherman's tall tale. This was the era of the Owicks reward. Herman Owicks, a wealthy banker, had famously offered $500 to anyone who could prove a shark attack had occurred north of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. The reward had sat unclaimed for decades. This fact was cited repeatedly in the days following Vincent's death. See, the experts, it has never happened before, therefore it cannot happen. Because of this dangerous arrogance, no beaches were closed, no warnings were issued to the towns further north. The death of Charles Vincent was treated as a freak accident, a lightning strike that would never strike twice. The bloody reception desk at the Ingleside Hotel was scrubbed clean. The guests, reassured by the managers, returned to the sand. They walked back into the water, convinced that the danger was gone. But the danger wasn't gone, it was moved. The predator, having tasted high-calorie prey, was following the coastline north. It was cruising along the New Jersey shoreline, passing sleepy fishing villages and crowded boardwalks. It traveled 70 miles in 5 days. It was a phantom, invisible beneath the waves, ignored by a society that believed it knew everything about the natural world. On July 6th, the shark reached the wealthy resort town of Spring Lake. The scene here was even more opulent than Beach Haven. The Essex and Sussex Hotel dominated the shoreline, a palace of luxury where Wall Street tycoons sent their families for the summer. The beaches were patrolled by lifeguards in rowboats, a sign of safety and order. Among the employees of the hotel was a 27-year-old Swiss bellman named Charles Bruder. Like Vincent, he was young and strong. He was a favorite among the guests, known for his kindness and his service. On his afternoon off, Bruder decided to go for a swim. He ventured out far beyond the lifelines. Confident in his ability, he was swimming in deep water, enjoying the cool Atlantic swells. On the shore, a woman named Mrs. George White watched him through binoculars. She commented to her friend that the man in the red canoe seemed to be having trouble. "That's not a canoe," her friend replied. "That's a man swimming." "But the water around him," Mrs. White said, lowering the glasses, her face turning pale. "The water is red," Bruder screamed. It was a scream that tore through the polite chatter of the beach crowd. Two lifeguards, Chris Anderson and George White, launched a boat and rowed towards him. As they approached, they saw Bruder thrashing. He shouted one sentence to them, a sentence that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "A shark bit me, bit my legs off." They pulled him into the boat. The sight was gruesome beyond words. The shark had taken both of his legs below the knees, and a large section of his abdomen. Bruder was conscious, but he was light as a feather as they lifted him. He had lost nearly all his blood. He looked at his legs, looked at the lifeguards, and passed. He died before the boat touched the sand. When the lifeguards carried the mutilated body of Charles Bruder onto the pristine beach of Spring Lake, the denial finally shattered. Women fainted, men vomited. The sand was stained red. This was not a turtle. This was not a tuna. The bite marks were massive, unmistakable. The realization hit the crowd like a physical blow. The monster was real. It was hunting, and it was getting hungrier. The Oryx reward was finally claimed. The beaches began to close. Panic spread up and down the East Coast like a virus. But even then, amidst the terror, no one suspected the shark's next move. They watched the ocean, scanning the horizon for a fin. They were looking in the wrong place. The shark wasn't staying in the deep. It was searching for a new hunting ground. It turned its head towards a break in the coastline, a tidal inlet leading to a quiet, brackish creek called Matawan. It was leaving the ocean. It was coming for the backyard. July 12, 1916, Matawan, New Jersey. If you look at a map of the 1916 attacks, the first two incidents make biological sense. Beach Haven and Spring Lake are oceanfront towns. They face the vast, open Atlantic. A predator swimming past the breakers is rare, but possible. But Matawan is different. Matawan is a small, quiet, industrial town, located 16 miles inland from the open ocean. It sits on the edge of a winding, muddy tidal inlet, known as Matawan Creek. To understand the horror of what was about to happen, you must visualize the creek. This is not the clear blue ocean. It is a narrow, meandering ribbon of brackish water, stained brown by silt and clay. It winds through marshes, under wooden road bridges, and past brick factories. It is a place of bullfrogs, snapping turtles, and catfish. At low tide, it is barely a trickle of mud. At high tide, it is a sluggish, opaque river maybe 30 feet across at its widest point. It is the kind of place where boys skip stones and catch crabs. It is the last place on earth anyone would look for a leviathan of the deep. But on this sweltering Wednesday morning, the impossible was navigating the channel. The shark, likely the same great white that had tasted blood in Spring Lake 6 days earlier, had entered the Raritan. Confused by the currents, or perhaps driven by a terrifying adaptability, it found the mouth of the creek. It didn't turn back. It swam forward. It pushed its massive gray body into the freshwater system. It passed under the railway trestle. It glided past the docks where workers were loading bricks. It was 10 miles from the nearest salt spray, deep in the heart of the New Jersey countryside. The first person to see the intruder was Captain Thomas Cottrell. Cottrell was a retired sea captain, a man who had spent his life on the ocean and knew the shapes of the deep. He was now working as a bridge tender, overseeing the new lift bridge that spanned the creek. It was early morning, the heat already rising off the water in shimmering waves. Cottrell was walking along the creek bank, checking the pilings, when he saw something that made his blood run cold. Below him, in the murky brown water, a dark shape was moving upstream. It wasn't a log. Logs drift with the current. This object was moving against. It was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet long. As it passed under the bridge, the sunlight caught the dorsal fin slicing through the surface. It was a gray shadow, silent and lethal, gliding through a habitat that should have been alien to it. Cottrell froze. He knew exactly what he was looking at, but his brain refused to accept the data. A shark, Here, in a creek where the water was barely deep enough to cover its dorsal fin, it was madness, but the captain didn't hesitate. He knew that just upstream, the local boys used the walk-off dock as a swimming hole. He knew the creek was crowded with children trying to escape the heat wave. He ran back to the town center. He burst into the local barber shop and the general store, shouting a warning that sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. "There is a shark in the creek," he yelled. "Get everyone out of the water." I saw it with my own eyes. The reaction of the townspeople was predictable. They didn't panic. They laughed. The men sitting on the porch of the general store shook their heads. They looked at the old captain with pity. "It's the heat, Tom," they said. "The sun has got to your head. A shark in Matawan Creek. You might as well say there's a whale in the bathtub." They dismissed him completely. To the people of Matawan, the shark attacks happening down the shore were distant tragedies, stories to read about in the newspaper with a shudder before turning the page. They felt safe. They were protected by miles of land and marsh. The idea that the Atlantic Ocean could reach out and touch them in their own backyard was biologically impossible, so the warnings were ignored. No alarm was raised. No bells were rung. The creek remained open, and down at the walk-off dock, a mile upstream from where Cottrell stood, a group of young boys was getting ready for a swim. Among them was Lester Stillwell. Lester was 11 years old, a frail but spirited boy. He worked at the Anderson weaving mill, but the heat inside the factory was unbearable that day. The owner had taken pity on the boys and let them go early for the afternoon. It was a gift of time, a chance to cool off. Lester and his friends, Charles Van Brunt, Frank Cagle, and Albert O'Hara, ran down the dusty path to the creek, stripping off their clothes as they went. They were laughing, pushing each other, filled with the boundless energy of youth. They reached the walk-off dock, an old, rotting wooden structure that jutted out into the widest part of the creek. The water here was deep, perhaps 10 or 12 feet at high tide, a perfect swimming hole. The boys dove in. The cool water was a relief from the 90-degree air. They splashed, played tag, and floated on their backs, staring up at the summer sky. They were completely unaware that a mile downstream, a grey engine of destruction was closing the distance. The shark was moving methodically in the murky water of the creek. Visibility was near zero. It relied on its ampullae of Lorenzini, the sensory organs in its snout, to detect the electrical impulses of living things. It could feel the vibrations of the boys splashing long before it could see them. The creek narrowed and widened, but the shark navigated the turns with eerie precision. It passed old tires, sunken logs, and industrial debris. It was an oceanic predator operating in a muddy trench. As the afternoon wore on, the boys began to get tired. The sun started to dip. The water, which had felt refreshing, began to feel heavy and dark. Most of the boys climbed out onto the dock to dry off in the sun, but Lester Stillwell wanted one last swim. He stayed in the water, floating near the center of the creek, drifting slightly with the current. He was alone in the water. Albert O'Hara, standing on the dock, noticed something. He saw a disturbance in the water downstream. A wake was forming, moving against the tide. It wasn't a boat. It was moving too fast, too smoothly. "Watch out, Lester," Albert shouted, though he didn't know what he was warning him about. "There's something coming." Lester laughed. He paddled his hands, keeping his head above water. He thought his friends were playing a prank. He thought they were trying to scare him. He didn't see the dark fin rise silently behind him. He didn't see the water displace as 9 feet of muscle accelerated for the strike. Then Lester's expression changed. He stopped laughing. He looked confused. He felt something rough, like sandpaper, brush against his leg. He looked down into the brown water, trying to see what had touched him. "It's a big log," Lester called out, his voice trembling slightly. "It scraped me." On the dock, the other boys went silent. They watched as the log turned. They saw the dorsal fin slice the surface again, circling the boy. Then they saw the tail thrash. The water around Lester erupted. It wasn't a log. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. The old captain hadn't been crazy. The monster was here. Lester screamed. It was a high, piercing sound that shattered the peace of the afternoon. He was jerked violently to the side. Then he was pulled under. He surfaced a second later, arms flailing, eyes wide with absolute terror. He yelled one word: "Shark." Then with a violent splash, he was gone. The boys on the dock stood frozen for a heartbeat.
their minds unable to process the violence they had just witnessed. The creek was calm again. Ripples spread out from the center. Then a plume of red blood rose to the surface, staining the muddy water. It swirled in the current, dark and thick. Panic exploded. The boys scrambled up the bank, naked and terrified, screaming for help. They ran towards the town, their feet pounding the dirt road. Shark! Shark! Lester is gone. A shark got Lester. Their screams echoed through the quiet streets of Matawan. This time, no one laughed. The terror in their voices was too real. The town woke up. Men dropped their tools. Women came out of their houses. The nightmare had arrived in the backyard. The creek, the place of childhood innocence, had just become a feeding ground, and the shark was still there, waiting in the dark water, with its pride.
The body of the shark caught by Michael Schleicher was not treated as a biological specimen. It was treated as a celebrity criminal. Within days of the capture, the taxidermied carcass was placed in the window of a shop on Broadway in New York City. Thousands of people lined the streets, pressing their faces against the glass to get a glimpse of the Jersey man-eater. For a dime, you could stare into the dead eyes of the monster that had terrorized a nation. It was a macabre spectacle, a physical manifestation of victory over nature. The panic subsided. The beaches reopened. The summer of 1916 eventually faded into autumn, and the Great War in Europe reclaimed the headlines. But while the public moved on, convinced that the nightmare was over, the scientific community was left with a puzzle that remains unsolved. More than a century later, the autopsy had proven that Schleicher's great white had eaten humans. The 15 pounds of flesh and bone found in its gut were undeniable. However, forensic biology is rarely simple. As modern ichthyologists and shark experts have revisited the case files of 1916, a disturbing theory has emerged. The shark hanging in the shop window was certainly a killer. But was it the killer of Matawan Creek? The controversy centers on biology, specifically a process called osmoregulation. The great white shark, Carcharodon carcharias, is an obligate marine predator. Its body is designed for the high salinity of the open ocean. If you place a great white in fresh water, its cells begin to absorb too much water. Its kidneys fail, and it slowly dies. It is a biological barrier, as real as a brick wall. Matawan Creek, where Lester Stillwell and Stanley Fisher were killed, is a tidal inlet. At high tide, it is brackish, a mix of salt and fresh water. But at low tide, and especially 11 miles inland where the attacks occurred, the salinity drops drastically. For a great white to swim that far up a narrow, muddy creek, pass under bridges, and hunt actively for hours in low salinity water, it would have to be suffering from immense physiological stress. It would be dying. It is not impossible. Animals do strange things when sick or lost, but it is highly improbable. This leads to the bull shark theory. The bull shark, Carcharodon lucus, is a biological anomaly. It possesses a specialized gland near its tail and a kidney function that allows it to switch effortlessly between salt water and fresh water. Bull sharks have been found thousands of miles up the Amazon River and the Mississippi. They have been found in golf course ponds and landlocked lakes. They are aggressive, territorial, and thrive in shallow, murky water. The environment of Matawan Creek, muddy, brown, narrow, is the perfect habitat for a bull shark, not a great white. Furthermore, the attack style in the creek matches the bull shark's profile. Great whites typically strike from below with a massive, singular bite, the test bite, and then wait for the prey to bleed out. This is what happened to Charles Vansant in Beach Haven. But the attacks in the creek were different. They were multiple, chaotic bites. The shark held on. It engaged in a tug of war,
It displayed the tenacity and pit bull-like behavior characteristic of a bull shark. So here is the terrifying possibility. The summer of 1916 might not have been the work of a single rogue monster. It might have been a perfect storm. It is highly probable that the attacks in the ocean, Beach Haven and Spring Lake, were indeed the work of the great white caught by Schleicher. But the attacks in the many experts now believe that was a second monster, a bull shark, that slipped into the inlet unnoticed, did its bloody work, and then slipped back out, never to be caught. If this is true, then the Jersey Devil, that killed Lester Stillwell and Stanley Fisher, was never brought to justice. It lived on, invisible, in the murky water. Regardless of the species, the events of 1916 birthed a new scientific concept, the rogue shark theory. Before this summer, sharks were viewed as scavengers. Like vultures of the sea, they were thought to be timid. The year 1916 introduced the idea that a single shark could develop a specific taste for human flesh and actively hunt people. This theory was championed by Dr. Victor Koppelson in the 1950s, using the Jersey Shore attacks as his primary case study. He argued that once a shark tastes human blood, it stops hunting fish and focuses on the easy prey found at beaches. While modern science has largely debunked the rogue shark theory, most attacks are cases of mistaken identity, not serial killing. The cultural impact remains indelible. The idea of the singular, malevolent predator became the archetype for our modern monsters. This brings us to the legacy of night. It is impossible to talk about these attacks without talking about In 1974, author Peter Benchley published his novel about a great white shark terrorizing a tourist town called Amity. Benchley did not invent the plot out of thin air. He studied the news clippings of 1916. The parallels are undeniable. In 1916, the attacks started early in the season. In Jaws, the same. In 1916, the hotel owners and town councils tried to suppress the news to save the tourist economy. In Jaws, Mayor Vaughn refuses to close the beaches for the 4th of July weekend because Amity is a summer town. The character of Quint, the shark hunter, mirrors the vigilante spirit of the men who threw dynamite into Matawan Creek. Even the climax of the book, where the shark dies not by an explosion but by exhaustion and wounds, mirrors the capture of Schleicher's shark. Steven Spielberg's movie adaptation in 1975 took this fear and amplified it globally. But it is crucial to remember that the fear didn't start in Hollywood, it started in New Jersey. Before 1916, humanity looked at the ocean with curiosity. After 1916, we looked at it with suspicion. We realized that the blue line of the horizon was not a border, it was a veil, hiding a wilderness we could not control. The attacks also led to the creation of the International Shark Attack File, ISAF. Science realized it needed to track these incidents. We began to study shark behavior, not just from biological specimens, but from forensic analysis of bites. We learned that sharks are not mindless eating machines. They are complex, cautious, and intelligent predators. The great white, in particular, is an ambush predator that relies on surprise. It does not want to fight. The fact that the 1916 shark, or sharks, fought so hard, attacking boats and rescuers, remains an outlier in the data. A statistical freak event that defies the norm. Another lasting legacy is the shift in beach safety. Before 1916, lifeguards were there to save people from drowning in rip currents. After 1916, the Shark Watch became a standard part of beach patrol. Towers were built higher, bells and sirens were installed. The ocean was fenced off with steel nets in many places in Australia and South Africa. A direct technological descendant of the crude chicken wire fences erected in Matawan Creek. But perhaps the most profound legacy is psychological. The Jersey Shore attacks violated the sanctity of the safe zone. We accept risk when we climb a mountain or trek through a jungle. We expect danger there, but a swimming hole, a creek in the backyard. That is supposed to be safe. The intrusion of the shark into the freshwater creek destroyed the illusion that we are separate from nature. It proved that if you are in the water, any water that connects to the sea, you are part of the food chain. Even today, residents of Matawan tell stories of the creek. They say the water feels different there. The Wyckoff dock is long gone, replaced by modern structures, but the history is embedded in the mud. Every time a large fish ripples the surface of the brown water, the memory of Lester Stilwell returns. The trauma of a small town became the trauma of a nation. The scientific debate will likely never be resolved. The DNA evidence is gone. The bones found in the shark's stomach were buried in an unmarked grave. We will never know for sure if it was one great white acting like a lunatic, or a tag team of a great white and a bull shark. But the ambiguity is part of the horror. If it was a bull shark, then the killer survived. If it was a great white, then we must accept that the impossible can happen. That the rules of biology are not absolute, and that nature can break them whenever it chooses. The summer of 1916 stands as a monolith in the history of survival. It was the moment we realized that we are not the landlords of this planet, we are merely tenants, and sometimes the eviction notice comes with teeth. It stripped away our arrogance. It forced us to respect the dark water, and it taught us that no matter how much concrete we pour, or how many bridges we build, the wild is always waiting just beneath the surface. If you visit Matawan Unyozi today, you will find a quiet, picturesque town. The brickyards are gone, replaced by suburban houses and paved roads. Matawan Creek still flows through the landscape, winding its way under modern concrete bridges towards the sea. At low tide, the mud banks lie exposed, smelling of salt and decay, just as they did in 1916. It looks peaceful, it looks innocent, but for the people who know the history, the water of the creek holds a dark memory that time cannot wash away. In the Rose Hill Cemetery on a quiet hillside overlooking the town, lies the grave of Lester Stilwell. He was 12 years old, a child of the summer, who went for a swim and never came home. Not far away is the grave of Stanley Fisher, the town hero. His tombstone stands as a monument to a kind of courage that is rare in this world, the courage to dive into the dark, bloody water, to save a child, knowing full well what was waiting in the deep. These graves are the permanent scars of the summer of. They are the human cost of our arrogance. Before that July we looked at the natural world as a painting, something beautiful, static, and safe to admire from a distance. We believed that our science had categorized every danger, and that our civilization had tamed the wild. The shark proved us wrong. It proved that nature doesn't follow our rules. It doesn't respect our borders. It doesn't care if we are in the deep ocean or a backyard creek. The legacy of these 12 days goes beyond the fear of sharks. It is a fundamental shift in our relationship with the planet. We realized that we are not the masters of the environment. We are simply participants in it. When we step into the ocean, we are crossing a threshold. We are entering a wilderness where we are slow, clumsy, and vulnerable. We are entering the food chain, not at the top, but somewhere comfortably in the middle. There is a chilling thought that lingers when one studies this case. If the bull shark theory is correct, if the monster that killed Lester and Stanley was indeed a separate animal from the great white caught in the bay, then justice was never served. The great white hanging in the shop window was a killer, yes, but perhaps not the killer of the creek. That implies that the beast of Matawan slipped away. It swam back down the muddy inlet, past the silent brickyards, and returned to the anonymity of the open ocean. It lived out its life, a ghost in the water, carrying the secret of the creek to its grave. It reminds us that for all our technology, all our sonars, and all our knowledge, the ocean remains a place of secrets. We have mapped the surface of Mars better than we have mapped the depths of our own seas. There are things swimming in the dark that we do not understand, and every once in a while they come into the shallows to remind us who really owns the water. So the next time you are at the beach, standing in the surf, feeling the cool water lap against your knees, look at the horizon. It looks empty, it looks calm, but remember that the thing you fear might not be in the deep water, miles away. It might be right beside you in the waist-deep water, where you feel safest. This brings our investigation of the real Jaws to a close. But now I want to hear your verdict, based on the evidence, the location, the multiple bites, the ferocity. Do you believe the killer of Matawan Creek was the great white caught by Michael Schleicher? Or do you believe the bull shark theory that a second unidentified monster invaded the river and escaped? Leave your theory in the comments below. I read every single one. If this deep dive into history and horror kept you on the edge of your seat, you have found your tribe. This channel is dedicated to the stories that prove reality is often terrifyingly stranger than fiction. But to survive what comes next, you need to be prepared. Make sure you are subscribed and have the notification bell turned on. Our next investigation will take us back to the old world, to the mist-covered forests of 18th century. We are going to hunt a creature that killed over 100 people, a beast that survived bullets, outsmarted the king's best hunters, and was said to be a demon sent from hell. Was it a wolf, a hyena, or something else entirely? The beast of Shivodan is next. Until then, stay out of the water.